I'm going to introduce the next speakers. We have a keynote fireside chat with Leslie Katz and Frances Haugen. So they will be talking about social media, about the rise of new social media platforms and the implications of governments. Frances is an advocate for social media transparency and accountability. Come on up, feel free to grab seats, grab mics. And Leslie is a former elected official working with a lot of crypto companies to navigate the regulatory and government affairs arena. I'm really looking forward to learning from both of you, so thanks, and take it away.
Well, thank you. Before we start, I guess, or as we start, I'd just like to say, when it comes to taking a stand, talk about taking a stand. So we can just give a shout out for Frances for taking such an amazing stand. I'm assuming everyone really knows what she did, but as an attorney, I really appreciate what it takes to do what she did, which is coming forward in an environment that's really not that hospitable to people coming forward. So thank you for your courage and for what you did. It's really making so many positive changes.
Is this on? Thank you. I've learned over time that not everyone is aware. Just for context, I brought forward 22,000 pages of documents from Facebook in the fall of 2021. And since then, I've been working with organizations around the world, with governments around the world, around understanding how can we push for transparency and accountability for social media platforms.
Yeah. Thank you. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you see the evolution that's taking place in the decentralized social media platforms.
So people often ask me, like, how do we solve the problem of social media? And talk to different people, and they'll identify different things that they would articulate as the problem. You know, some people might talk about censorship. People might talk about impacts on kids. People might impact on much more broad things like terrorism or human trafficking. In my mind, the problem of social media really comes down to incentives and to control. Right now, all of these platforms are advertising supported. That means they make their money by keeping you on there as long as possible. And they are often owned by single people. They're controlled by single people. So I always get a little annoyed when people get peeved about Elon Musk and how Elon Musk is the only person who controls Twitter, because Mark Zuckerberg has been the only person controlling Facebook for like 20 years. Right? This is not just like an Elon thing. Web3 social media, I think, is a huge opportunity because it's about ways of giving people control. Like if there had been a DAO governing Facebook, it would have never turned into what it did. It's about incentives, things like imagine if creators controlled these platforms. Like right now, you have people who make their livelihoods on these platforms, and they have no ability to influence the rules that govern them or how their content is distributed. And so I think there's a huge amount of opportunity in the Web3 space for addressing some of the core things that I think really led social media astray.
Could you talk maybe a little bit about where you see the role of privacy now in Web3?
So almost certainly, we're going to see a rise of end-to-end encrypted social media, because like one of the major differentiating factors of a lot of these decentralized social media platforms is privacy. I think it's going to be really interesting because in the new evolving regulatory environment, unless we proactively design for safety, privacy and safety are going to come into conflict. There's not a necessary, like a required conflict, but we have to think about these things proactively.
To that point, I had to write it down because it was such a ridiculous name, but it's in this current iteration of Congress, most of the social media bills that have been introduced so far relate to children, and this is one, the bill to permit parents to bring civil action against social media companies that fail to provide parental access and data control rights regarding social media accounts of minors. But it highlights really, I think, where the regulatory arena and the policymakers are looking, and I think it's a message for all of us. It's going to be incumbent on all of us to figure out how do we address these concerns without curtailing the growth of the companies. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about where you see that going.
Well, I think there's a difference between privacy for adults and making sure that parents are able to have a role in their children's lives. One of the recurrent patterns that we've seen is there's been an escalating growth in the suicide rate for children. You look at the graphs and they're very clearly hockey sticking in the last, say, 7 years. and there are huge correlations with social media usage. And so in the case of a lot of the ones around giving parents rights to be involved, it's that in a huge fraction of those cases where social media played a role, parents only find out after their kids died that the algorithms were pushing their kids towards feeds that were just back-to-back, very depressing, content glorifying suicide or self-harm, those kinds of things. But for adults, we shouldn't, usually the conflicts that I see where I really chafe, where people say privacy is in conflict with security, is around things like predation, right? So we are in a world now where grooming narratives and child predators are even more prevalent than when I was a kid in the 90s when the internet was really dangerous. And in that case, there are ways of designing social media where we put more control in the hands of kids. We can have things where on the client side, we can begin giving more tools to kids so they can be aware this person is contacting a lot of kids, or this person is not acting in a way that is aligned with being a child, just so you're aware. And so I'm always big about how do we put autonomy and control back in the hands of users. And we have to proactively design that way if we want these systems to still be safe once they go end-to-end encrypted.
And that kind of leads into my next question. What are some of the things that we need to be considering with respect to the building of end-to-end encryption in social media?
And I think there are questions around scale. So once we get into questions around algorithms, we need to keep in mind that the way regulation is changing, if we want social media, the transition to decentralized social media to be successful, we have to take into mind what is the current regulatory environment internationally. So the European Union has passed a law called the Digital Services Act, and it says that if you touch more than 10% of the users in the European Union, you are now required to comply with a long list of transparency objectives. And I think one of the things that we're going to have to trade off is either accept that decentralized platforms can only grow to a certain size, because otherwise they'll have to comply with these systems, or to think proactively about what are ways that we can allow people to opt in to contributing to transparency. So for example, right now there are people who volunteer to provide, for example, the ads they receive to observatories that are monitoring biases in how Facebook distributes ads. Facebook responded to that when that happened by suing the researchers because they showed that Facebook was basically lying about a variety of their policies. But you could imagine beginning to think about what are ways that we can still have ways of holding a platform accountable, being able to research a platform, but where we put the control in the hands of users. And so saying things like, hey, would you like to opt in to be able to provide data? You can meaningfully, in a way, allow us to study these platforms. You don't have to do it from a central observatory perspective.
I think you sort of touched on it, but are there some other things that you can think of that would help make the platform safer?
I think there's questions around how do you give tools, for example, to kids, right? So right now, a lot of social media platforms don't want to acknowledge danger. So it's a lot like what the automotive industry was like in the 1960s. Like in the 1960s, prior to Ralph Nader writing Unsafe at Any Speed, the automotive industry knew a lot of ways to make cars safer, things like seatbelts. No car in the United States had default seatbelts in 1965. But they didn't want to talk about safety because then people would be like, wait, no one else is talking about safety. Are your cars more dangerous than everyone else's? Similarly today, you can imagine a world where you gave more avenues for kids to be able to flag people who were behaving inappropriately to them. You could imagine ways in which kids could support each other. But if you begin to build those tools, or for example, compulsive use, imagine building into your platform tools that give control to users about compulsive use. Things like, instead of just popping up a reminder at 10 and saying it's awfully late, do you want to go to bed? We've known for years that if you slow down an interface, people use it less. If an app that actually wanted to address compulsive use for kids would do things like say, hey, when do you want to stop using the app tonight? For 2 hours before that bedtime, the app could slow down a little and slow down a little, slow down a little, and around your bedtime, you'd want to go to bed. But if you build that feature, you're admitting your platform might be dangerous. And so there are things like this where you can design to put control back in the hands of users. And I think in a world where the users and the creators own the platform, they have an incentive to care for each other in their community in a way that is different than just having a centralized corporation say, you know, our best, we're just trying to maximize for growth.
Well, I think in a world where we're letting people take back ownership of their data, it's huge. And figuring out ways to do that. I know it's one thing with adults, it's certainly different with children, but when we look at what we're doing and in terms of the privacy and the letting people onto platforms, you have entities like Signal or MobileCoin that have incredible privacy built into the tools, but also ways of making sure that you don't let bad actors in. So that's sort of this dance that has to be done.
And it can be done. Like I always say, there's nothing intrinsically dangerous about encryption. It's about the combination of what features go along with encryption.
Yep.
On Facebook Messenger, there is a directory of children attached to that messaging platform. On Signal, the only way you get to contact a child is if you know the child's phone number, right? Like they're different kinds of worlds.
Kind of led into my next question. Are there things in your past, some of your prior experiences, including potentially at Meta or Facebook, that you can draw parallels to? And then if so, how do we not recreate some of those same problems?
Well, I think it's a thing like, so the difference between a social media platform that is subscription-based, or like where the users are the owners of the platform, and one that's advertising-based. When I worked on Pinterest, I launched a feature that increased global consumption by 6%. So there was a bias in the algorithm that pushed the feed towards homogeneity. Basically show you the same kind of things over and over again, because AI is not intelligent. It doesn't understand boredom. So overnight, 6% more pins were being viewed globally. So when people talk about compulsive use or like mindless scrolling, I am partially to blame. But we only increased advertising revenue by 2.5%. And the reason for that is when you extend sessions, the most money the platform makes from you is right at the beginning. So you get 1,000 pins in, they're making less money from you than if you were in the first 100 pins. You could imagine a world where the platform said, okay, what's the incremental cost to you from consuming more versus the incremental gain you get from consuming more? At some point, it's in the global best interest to help you turn off your app. For Netflix, they have an active incentive to get you off because they're paying for your data, right? They're paying for you to stream. And so if you just sit there for too long, just mindlessly watching, they'll pop up a thing saying, are you still there? And that's because it's a subscription service. They're not going to get more money from you for keeping you on and making you stay up until 2. In the case of, I think in a world where you had user-owned platforms, creator-owned platforms, there's more of an incentive to say, hey, like, you're really, you've been on here for hours today. We don't think that's actually, like, we should make sure you're making conscious choices. You're not doing regretted use. Because otherwise we'd be using you as a means to an end. Like in the case of an advertising platform, the longer they keep you there, the more money they make off you.
It's kind of in Netflix, I think the next thing that's going to be coming up, which is tying in a little bit to privacy, is trying to figure out who's on the platform and who's using.
Yeah, the account lockdown thing, password sharing. Yeah.
It'll be interesting. So sort of switching a little bit and touching, I guess, on what some of the prior speakers have said, and I think it's probably going to be a recurring theme here, but I would be remiss if I didn't say, and I'm going to repeat a phrase I think others have said it perhaps at this conference, but if you don't have a seat at the table, you're on the menu. And it really highlights how important it is that we all show up and educate policymakers and regulators. And I'm trying to look at sort of the silver lining of the whole FTX debacle. And the beauty of that is it's made regulators and policymakers a little bit more aware of the industry. I mean, much of my job, I joke, is serving as a translator between people in the technology industries and people in the policy and regulatory worlds. And I remember the first case that I was involved in, which the SEC came in, and so we're helping my client kind of navigate through that. Their questions were so basic.
It's shocking.
It was mind-numbing. And we felt like we were having to give them a crash course in blockchain. And we saw the iteration get a little bit better, but when you talk to legislators, there's very few at the congressional or the Senate level that really have a good grasp of what we're doing. They have to know so many different areas.
I like to joke sometimes that the crypto industry should sponsor me, because I end up in all these conversations with politicians or like legislative aides, and it's so weird. I am not a crypto expert. Like I am in the halo of the community, a lot of friends there, but because I'm a technologist and they don't necessarily sit down with that many, they always ask me crypto questions for like the last 5 minutes. They're like, actually, we have a couple of questions about crypto. And it's just amazing. Like even people who I would consider some of the more informed technology related politicians still ask incredibly basic questions.
And so I guess a plea to all of you is take the opportunity to meet with your local, it starts, people bubble all the way up. Meet with your local electeds, meet with your members of Congress. It's really important that they hear from people in the crypto field to get educated, because it is, I'm constantly amazed at the lack of deep understanding that's there. And I think if that were the case, we would see a lot better pieces of legislation coming out that would recognize the tools and the opportunity presented by crypto. So instead, we're just seeing a lot of enforcement action, and it's in part because that's the prism that they're looking at things from. They're seeing bad actors because that's the sexy news stories, and they're not seeing all of the opportunities like what we're going to see in social media platforms in Web3. It's really an opportunity to correct some of the problems we've seen elsewhere, but most of the folks making the policy decisions don't fully understand that. So there's a few members there, and Senators Loomis and Gillibrand have a piece of legislation, and I loved I think it was Senator Loomis, it might have been Gillibrand. One of them said after FTX, they said, well, the good news about it is we now see where we don't want to make mistakes in our legislation and have unintended consequences. But it shouldn't take something like FTX to bubble up when we have so many knowledgeable people here that they would love to hear from. And I've had multiple electeds, both statewide constitutional officers and others, that have said, can you bring me a group of experts that can help me understand what this is so I do the right thing? And I think there's going to be more and more opportunities for that. So please take advantage.
And I would particularly encourage, if you are working on any project that has utility tokens, that has a focus on governance, those kinds of things, those messages are not getting out. Like the idea that you can use crypto for things other than stores of value is just, it's like nowhere. And so please, please, please make the time and spread the message.
And interestingly, I was speaking with somebody who you'll probably hear from a little bit later, but they made the point that if we get good regulation, then law enforcement can focus on that small portion of bad actors and not be scattershot. And I think that's a message that needs to go to regulators as well, that doing it the right way is going to free up the proper approach and allow the industry to expand and grow in ways that I think everyone will benefit from. So thank you very much. We've got 33 seconds.
Yeah. And on time.
But Francis, thank you for everything you do and for being the ambassador for the crypto industry when you're up on the Hill. So.
Yeah. Any little bit helps. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.